Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce Kamal Sinclair. I'm just going to read from her bio here. Kamal Sinclair serves as the director of the Sundance Institute's New Frontier Labs program, which supports artists working at the convergence of film, art, media, and technology. She works also as a consultant to the Ford Foundation's JustFilms program and to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, and as an artist and producer on the Question Bridge Black Males Transmedia Art Project. At New Frontier at the Sundance Institute, she partners with Chief Curator Shari Frilot to develop and present landmark projects in the evolution of storytelling, including experiments with virtual reality, augmented reality, and data as storytelling media. Kamal Sinclair was recently profiled by New York Magazine as a national leader in the VR industry. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm terrifically pleased to introduce Kamal Sinclair.
Hello, everyone. I wish I was here at the next lecture on the, teledildonics situation. I don't know if mine's gonna be quite as spicy, but I will try to entertain you as much as I can. I'm really happy to see the turnout here. I got a chance to spend some time with some of you and some of your peers earlier today and get to see the incredible work that is happening here on this university campus. Some incredible minds and some very talented people are in this room. And as I was telling them earlier, I get an opportunity because of the vantage point I have at Sundance of having, all of these incredible artists submit their babies to us to look at and to see, what they're doing. We get to see this kind of spectrum of the work that's happening in the field. And because of that, I can say very confidently that you guys are very, very fortunate to be in this campus in these programs and working with people like Golan. Golan actually, when I first got this job 8 years ago, I started Googling to try to make myself sound like I knew what I was talking about, and Golan came up and I started following him from then, and I am just so honored to be here today, to be introduced by you. Thank you. I've done something right if I'm getting introduced by you, so thank you very much, Golan. A lot of respect right here. So I'm gonna talk to you, it's a lot of information and a lot of slides, so just bear with me. Just think of it as a montage that's just gonna be happening above my head. Don't try to keep it all, the stuff is online, but I'm gonna share a little bit of overview of what my experience has been being part of this rich community of artists and technologists that are trying to further storytelling and image making. But I'm also going to talk about it a little bit through the lens of some research that I had the honor of doing with the Ford Foundation a couple of years ago. And they charged me to look at the field of emerging media through the lens of their core mission, which is equality. And I want to just talk a little bit about, how that research is kind of informed my sense of how we can optimize the opportunities that are ahead of us. And the last thing I'll say is that you guys are in an incredible position as you guys leave this campus and go off into your careers to actually be the ones that decide what all of this is. And right now we're in this very undefined place. It's emerging, and that's the nature of emergence. But I'm really excited that to follow you as you guys go out into your careers and start shaping this with your value systems and with your creativity about what this means for the future of culture. All right, so I'm gonna make a fairly bold statement. I think we've been in a kind of an epoch of media, which is called mass media, right? Until about 40 years ago or so. And that time, when you think about where we were when the printing press came out and where we are now, and kind of in terms of our worldviews, mass media did a fundamental disruption to our sense of what reality was, right? We were able to see Vietnam War from our living rooms and change our relationship of distance to war, and we were able to some people were able to actually have a Bible in their home, which changed a little bit their relationship with clergy. We had the opportunity to see Earth from space, and that changed a lot of people's perceptions of borders and what it means to be a humanity versus a citizen or a nationality. And the artists and the philosophers, they showed up to try to make meaning of that fundamental disruption to our sense of reality. You had movements such as postmodernism and surrealism and Dadaism and all these things of artists trying to grapple with the ways in which our reality was shaken by the technological advancements of mass media. And I would argue that we are now, over the last 40 years, transitioned into a new epoch of media. And that is one that you guys are all deeply involved in, whether you want to be or not, just by the nature of the generational level that we're at. And that is the most dynamic, complex, and abundant communication system that's ever been on the planet, and that's ever been human beings have had to wield the power of. And that is not only the internet and not just broadcast media and mass media, but something that has this kind of interactive relationship. But it also is becoming smart, and it's becoming in every object and landscape around us, and it's also something that is being embedded in our own bodies, right? So this is a very complicated and complex environment that you guys are, imagine being around when the printing press was first created, or when television was first created. You guys are at that dawning point to shape, as the cultural leaders, as the people that are connecting with the technologists, as technologists and artists and philosophers and people that are thinking about this. You're the ones that are going to be creating the movements of trying to make sense of the ways in which this is disrupting our sense of reality. And trust me, the further I go down the rabbit hole of some of these things, the more existential crisis I have. So I hope that you guys do a lot of meaning making with this. And when I talk about meaning making, when I first got my job at Sundance, my boss is the person, Michelle Satter, who built Sundance with Robert Redford over the last 40 years. And my first week, she said, so what our job is to go out there and find artists that are making meaning. And for years, I thought she meant making meaningful work. And it wasn't until I was in a movie theater watching a film about cancer after my mom had gone through a cancer battle that I realized that all the little pedestrian things that I did when she was going through that battle, making sure she had tea, making sure she had her medication, asking her if she wanted me to turn up the volume on the TV, it was all very pedestrian, and it was all these little tiny movements within that relationship. And it wasn't until I was sitting alone in that movie theater for an hour and a half that the weight of the meaning of everything in our relationship and her own mortality, my own mortality, and the life that we've lived together actually hit. And I understood the meaning of all of those little pedestrian gestures that were in our relationship battling her cancer. And so I say that because it took me, I was well into my 30s and well into my career before I really understood what meaning making is and what artists do in terms of that meaning making. And that's when you're dealing with things that are disrupting our sense of reality, that meaning making is fundamental. So I did this project with the Ford Foundation called Making a New Reality that started where I interviewed people from all over the field, people from the public media, people from studios in Hollywood, people from Silicon Valley, people that are doing DIY, grassroots, maker spaces, Black Lives Matter activists. Like, I kind of did a really broad look and asked them all, how do we further equality in emerging media, including Golan. Thank you very much for being one of my interviewees. And I asked them 3 fundamental questions, and these are people that supported the project. I asked everybody, what is emerging media, just to try to get a sense of scope around it. I asked them, what are their concerns in terms of equality? And I asked them, for every concern that you give me, please give me at least one thing that is an intervention that could mitigate that concern, so that we have something to hold on to move forward and not just the critique. And so I'm gonna share kind of the overview of what I found through that process. So first, a really boring graph, but you can see it's kind of hilarious. I asked, what is emerging media? And you can see the VR going off the charts, right? But that's kind of an obvious one that people can say quite easily. But the nuances that I found in this kind of survey is what I hope to uncover. The stuff that isn't as emerging, stuff that is happening that is not on the radar with the big kind of hype as the VR bubble. One was interesting was tactile media. A lot of people talked about how we are bodies. We're not just eyes and we're not just ears, and that there's an aspect of our understanding of how meaning is made and what is meaningful that comes from the tactile space, that comes from our full body embodiment. And so there are artists that are playing with how do I, in a very digital and a very virtual environment, still unlock aspects of our emotional condition as human beings with our bodies. And so this is an artist named Lynette Wallworth who interviewed women that had gone through some of the worst atrocities of the human condition, Darfur, the Holocaust, wars, and she interviewed them, and she put their stories into a book. So you walk in and you read their stories in installation, and then you walk up to a door, a black screen, and you put your hand on the screen, and through a randomized algorithm, one of the women, life's human scale, will walk out of the darkness and put her hand directly onto your hand. And that was the simple gesture, that was it. But it really impacted people. People were like bawling, crying in the exhibition. And that shows you that even the digital representation of this woman, there was something about the nature of touch that was still able to be accessed through these technologies. Similarly, this project Hue, which is tablet-based and VR-based and using haptics, and has a relationship where they're asking the question, can I have a physical relationship with the main character, the protagonist of a story? In this story, you're able to hold the hand of the character, you're able to kind of, push his shoulder, wake him up out of his depression and stupor. You're able to kind of, have a little bit of a tactile relationship with him that does have a really interesting, it creates an interesting relationship. Live documentary is a thing now, which is it reminds me of different ways that you call theater, but Sam Green is a phenomenal documentarian, and he's playing with live documentary. Obviously, interactive film continues to be something that people are pushing, and now with Bandersnatch and all that stuff, there's some pickup in terms of the industry. But this was one of the first interactive films that I felt. Has anybody seen Possibilia? Okay, so this is done by the Daniels, and they did the story with, they just check them out. You'll know their work. But this was the first interactive film that was able to achieve agency and choice for the audience without losing cinematic fluidity, which was always a challenge with kind of choose your own adventure, where you're stop and have to make a choice. It kind of did a little bit of a kind of stop and go feeling to the fluidity of the story and the fluidity of the cinema, and they were able to figure out a way to keep that going, but still give you up to 12 selections at one point quite brilliantly. Of course, escape rooms and alternate reality games. I used to run alternate reality games for 42 Entertainment back in the day with giant ARGs around Spider-Man and all these things. So it's interesting to see how it's shifting from kind of the ARG to the escape rooms. But this is one ARG that we ran for 20,000 people in Park City. How artists are trying to understand kind of what is native about documentary and what is native about gaming, that in trying to find what stories make sense in kind of hybridity between those. This is a story that one of our artists that went through the revolution in Iran back in 1979, when he saw the Arab Spring happening from Western perspective on TV, he said, they just don't get it. They don't understand the fog of revolution. They don't understand what it's like to be in it and not understand the moral survival and physical political choices that you're making and what the consequences are. And so he decided to use this historical moment 40 years back to put you through the agency of gaming into the position to be complicit with history and have to make the choices that someone did make. And whatever choice you make, you have to live out the consequences of what happened to somebody that actually had to live out those consequences, which is an interesting way of thinking about the why, not just the can we, but what is the why with some of these innovations. I'm going to go a little fast, but this is a piece by Porpentine and Peter Burr. Porpentine is a trans woman who's really interested in as trans people as the first biohackers, and has used not only digital spaces and gaming techniques, but also the body as the agent of moving through these spaces and trying to understand the embodiment of what it means to be trans and kind of using your body to hack into these digital spaces. Coral Rekindling Venus, this incredible dome piece. I won't go into more detail. Transmedia, we're still seeing trends around how story lives on different platforms and not in duplicity, but in evolution. We're seeing participatory media still continue to be a thing and a trend. Omnidirectional storytelling, breaking away from linear. We're seeing geo-aware storytelling still. This is a novel that took place all over the United States, where you could also contribute from the spaces that the novel was geocached in. Geo-aware composition, this is something that I find really interesting, both for site-specific stuff as well as for the gaming world. This composition was mapped to the landscape of the mall in Washington. I think there's 400 different ways in which you can meander around the mall to hear the composition constructed in 400 different ways, and get to the obelisk and all the, the whole symphony and the whole choir comes in. So this is interesting to think about how we are mapping story and content to space and architecture. And this is a project that's an AR/VR project geocached in Williamsburg. And the artist was really interested in the invisible and tangible kind of things that we bulldoze over through gentrification without knowing it. He talked about how, like when I was, the way that I relate to it is when I was this California girl coming up to Harlem back in the 90s, my boyfriend, I would see some chicken bones in the corner and be like, oh, this is really gross. Why are people just throwing their trash in the corner? And he was like, actually, that's a Santeria thing warding off spirits for that bodega. And I had no idea. And so he's trying to use AR and VR to make visible the social norms and the kinship systems that we that are completely invisible to those of us that are coming in to communities without that literacy. Ephemeral media was something that I thought was really interesting. The idea of liveness and ritual and what does it mean to be part of something that hasn't tracked you since you were born, like Facebook, but something that is really a moment in time. Incredible project. This is coming in 2019 to New York City. Incredible artists that are playing with projection mapping in space. I won't tell you more, but a light puppet. You get to hold a light puppet. It's incredible. I think it's interesting to think about data, and obviously we're creating terabytes, billions of terabytes of data that are going out into our ecosystem and trying to make meaning with that. And of course you have kind of like the data visualization type clay that a story was emergent out of, like what we saw with We Feel Fine back in 2007, where they scraped the blogosphere 65 million times to get an essence of what it means to be human. But I think it's really interesting to think about the new shape of data, which in the Internet of Things is what they're calling ambient data storytelling. This is an artifact from the African diasporic future made by the IAPO repository, where it's a speculative object, obviously, but you can walk around New York City, and it does work now, but you can walk around New York City and it lights up wherever you pass a spot where a black person has been killed by a police officer. And so the idea that there's no screen, there's no audio, there's no moving image, but the story is so rich inside of this ambient data device. I won't go into more, but just thinking about how objects become the canvas of storytelling, where they're not stuck in screens anymore, where you're thinking about like the Twitter tableau that prints analog pictures of certain hashtags. I imagine what's the world going to look like when there aren't screens or there are less screens? Like what's our relationship to story into the digital kind of omniverse around us when it's connected with these objects, and how are artists going to hack into that to make meaning? This is an artist that is, creating episodic storytelling over Alexa, which is a conversational relationship with the characters, and where the story can hack into the smart objects in your home and try to craft something that and they're using the seance genre right now, but they're actually looking at multiple genres. What does that look like? What does storytelling look like when Netflix is taking over your home rather than just your screen? I don't know. Even smell-o-vision. Has anybody heard about this piece? Yes, anybody tried this piece? Okay, this is a piece that was at Future Storytelling a couple years ago, where you live through the last moments of JFK's life through sound and through documentary audio and smell. And apparently it was quite powerful. And you're in this box, so that can, I guess, create a certain sense of intensity as well. I wouldn't want to be in there. And then again, thinking about characters not staying put on screens. One of our artists worked with Arcade Fire on the Just Reflector video, which had an app that you could manipulate not only the light that was happening, but at the end, the protagonist falls into your screen and your image falls into the video, and you become part of that story world. So a lot of our artists are trying to figure out, how does Hamlet live in your pocket, and how do characters just kind of not stay put in the traditional ways in which they're normally entrenched and captured. I don't know, I think I'll skip past this one maybe a little bit. No? This is, Unity put this together from a lot of the work that was at the festival this year. I'll just let you look at it, a little eye candy. Have you seen any of those pieces? Yeah? What piece have you seen? Oh, good. It's okay. I don't want to test you, put you on the spot, but that's one of the challenges, right? So, we were talking about earlier. I was at Brown University last weekend, and me and Luc Dubois, which is Golan's dear friend and counterpart at NYU. We went through a slideshow like this, and we said, who's seen any of these? And nobody raised their hand, and that's part of the challenge that we have to, kind of change the scope of access, because how are you gonna, if you're not learning and seeing what other people are doing and being able to kind of build as a community, how are we gonna evolve these things so that there's, we're not seeing it as creators, how are the audience gonna connect to it? But that's one of the major hurdles right now in the space. Obviously, I won't go into all the details, but we showed the first prototype of the Oculus Rift back in 2012. In fact, it was made to bring a work by Noni de la Pena to Sundance. So I've kind of been in this kind of front row seat of watching this particular strand of emerging media evolve. And obviously, we've seen, the kind of early days of just drop a 360 camera and run and hide, and kind of capturing things like the intimacy of being inside of a yurt in Mongolia, the ways in which Eve and kind of major franchises take it and are experimenting with it. The idea of, the moment where room scale all of a sudden became whoa, we're not just looking at in a 360 thing on a stick, but you're actually starting to feel a sense of faithfulness to your pedestrian scale and your mobility, the ability to kind of start to take over and interact. This is a piece where you are a tree in the Amazon rainforest, and you go through the whole process from seedling all the way to getting chopped down through deforestation and burned. The ways in which people have tried to create experiences to give you a sense of what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, like Unrest or Notes on Blindness. This was a pretty landmark piece, and being the first thing that I could confidently say had proved the medium of VR, because this was a powerful piece that could not have been done in any other medium. And then you're seeing works. I met these folks in South Africa this year through Electric South, and they're doing some innovation over there that is incredibly beautiful, mixing, kind of installation and in virtual worlds. But what was really interesting also was kind of the cultural context and lens, little things that changed how they're innovating over there versus how we're innovating over here, particularly with who gets to innovate. And there they were finding that, Black folks didn't want to put something on their head like that, especially if you have an afro. So they took off the headset piece, and they allow you to hold it like this, like a mask. So now, the idea of kind of just this kind of problem of having an afro and not wanting to dent it, changing, creating an opportunity for innovation in terms of the experience of how we approach an on-ramp into a virtual experience. Volumetric capture, different artists are playing with that. Noni de la Pena just launched Reach, which is a web-based platform for not only being able to access a catalog of photogrammetry environments, but also using DepthKit, an easy way to put volumetrically captured people into space to try to make it lower the barriers to enter for making. We also are seeing the exact opposite of that with something like Running with Reggie Watts, where he was one of the first signature pieces to come out of the Intel array in LA, which is a 180 camera array, and cost $250,000 to be in there for 2 days. So this piece was very expensive, but quite phenomenal when you think about the quality that they were able to capture out of it. Hyperreality, different ways in which that manifests. This was an embodiment of flying as a bird over San Francisco, the ways in which artists are kind of bringing in speculative objects and neuroscience and art into one thing. This is Hyphen Labs, where they have like Octavia Butler brain optimization pieces, and they're tracking brain activity while you're in a world where Black women are noble and honored and centered and powerful. We are seeing artists like Marshmallow Laser Feast that just had this crazy idea of, I want to be able to, kind of eat cotton candy and track cotton candy in VR, but like have an Alice in Wonderland kind of like Mad Hatter dinner party, and they did it, and now you're able to kind of track food and consume food and have it be faithful to its relationship into these avatar, to its virtual object. Performance in VR, the ways in which people are taking real-time performance and real-time cinematography, obviously like Bjork appearing in her avatar. This is another artist we showed this year that is puppeting avatars in real time in terms of theater, and it was quite phenomenal to watch the relationship of a real body in space and the avatar in space in a strong narrative context. This is an artist that is going into extreme performance art, where he's going to be embodying this gentleman for 30 days straight, where he's living in the VR headset and seeing a live stream of the gentleman's point of view, and going to try to mirror his body, including going to the bathroom when he goes to the bathroom, brushing his teeth when he brushes his teeth. And this is not only a performance art piece, but he's also trying to understand, is this going to change the nature of his relationship to reality, and I guess in a sense, and he's working with various researchers to track, does this change anything in his in terms of biometrics, or in his is this going to impact his eyesight? Is it going to impact his brain in any way? So that's going to be interesting. And then to see theater taking on, like the National Theater, one of the most respected theater companies in the world, doing things at the intersection of these technologies and live performance. This was a piece in Alice in Wonderland where the Cheshire Cat was an actor in mocap and was completely facial mocapped in real time. So as a Cheshire Cat, you're hearing live audio, the actor's all around you, but his face is tracked to the cat exactly, and it's kind of a surreal experience. They did it again with a piece about a son interaction with his mother as she's going through a cancer battle, and you can see the one-to-one relationship between the actor and the audience, where she puts you to bed and she draws with you, and people found this to be quite effective, incredibly powerful. Did anyone experience this piece in Tribeca? No, okay. And then trying to hack the isolationist relationship with VR, not only in terms of shared screening, but also in terms of social AR. Like this piece, this is your experience in real life. Was absolutely my favorite social VR piece I've ever experienced. It was so faithful to my body and so faithful to my relationship with the other people and to the other avatars. It was quite magical. Light field technology, people trying to, innovate on how can we walk into a video, how can we walk into a picture that's much more photoreal and realistic in terms of how Lightro's innovating there. And then we're going to go into like the AR world, right? We all know about that. Holo Cinema, Magic Leap, Microsoft HoloLens, mixed reality, people that are shifting between AR and VR. This was one of my favorite HoloLens pieces ever, because I was able to see a little theater about this dollhouse size and see the dancers dancing inside, and then I was able to put my head into it and go full room scale, where I was seeing the world as. And then I came back out of it, and it became Dollhouse, and I was able to hold the dancers on my hands and throw them away, and it was just quite magical. But she kept everything within the field of view that made sense because Microsoft's limitations. This was one of the best AR narrative pieces we showed this year. It was a dollhouse with projection mapping, but through the phone. They had full-on narrative scenes that were happening with these small light characters all around. This is Magic Leap with Royal Shakespeare Company, playing with, how that is impacting performance and live performance. And now we're getting into AI. So obviously we've been around artists that are creating generative art where they're co-creating with algorithms, and they never see their same work twice, like Marina Zerkow. But it's interesting to see how that's evolving. Has anybody seen Sunspring? Okay, so this is one of our artists, had an AI lab, Amelia Winger Bearskin. And you can see it's still very much gibberish. The AI is making, writing the script, and not only wrote the script, but the AI did the entire art direction and the props and the staging and blocking. So they literally had to, follow this really crazy scenario. But look at it, and you can see how limited it still is, but it's getting much better, right? So this was a piece that was an AI, a piece that kind of learned through our emotion that we had last year, but it was it was kind of eating the emotions based on facial recognition technology and trying to understand our stated emotions with our facial emotions. We had Frankenstein AI, which you saw. Again, a social AI that came to the festival still like a toddler, speaking kind of gibberish, like, don't you hate it when you go to the public restroom and you do pirouettes on the toilet, like those kinds of gibberish things, but grew and I would say got fairly evolved by the end of the festival, eating the data or learning the social and emotional data from the audience, having all these people kind of go through on a daily basis. And then at the end, puppeted a performance where it controlled, based on the mapping of the emotions that it consumed by us, was able to control Adreno-driven drums, projection mapping lighting systems, and generative images off the internet, as well as a dancer that had an earpiece in her ear and was meat puppeted by the AI, and the choreography was completely connected to the emotional data points that was captured. Lauren McCarthy is an artist you guys should all know about. She's pretty phenomenal, and she's interrogating these home AIs like Alexa or Google Home and thinking about the future of work. And she's saying, if the future of work is emotional labor, and we're putting these AIs to help facilitate the emotional and identity construction in our homes, she's wondering, is the future of work being a human interface where the AI does the grunt work, but the human remains the emotional kind of stopgap between us and raising our children and developing our relationships and creating identity, which is where the home, where all that stuff happens, is in the home. So she performs being your Alexa for a week, and she comes in and wires your home and does all these things. And it's part endurance test, but it's also part kind of challenging this sense of where the limitations of the AI will be in terms of the future of work. She did it again with a 24-hour cocktail party where has anyone heard about this piece? She basically fed a lot of social data of her guest list into a customized smart system and had the AI select at groups of 8 over 24 hours, 8 over 24 hours, the kind of the optimal construction of who should be in the party in order to have the optimal social interaction. And then she performed as the meat puppet for the AI, where everything she said, every introduction she made, every comment, all came from the AI kind of sparking her. And as an experiment can AI even do that better than humans in terms of the future of work, of optimizing our social interaction, and also playing with endurance with the human body and a machine. And then, of course, there's people that are thinking about this in other ways, like the future of memoir and history, with the Shoah Foundation, capturing, volumetrically capturing a Holocaust survivor. As we know, that generation is dying out rapidly, and creating a conversational relationship with them so that as the generation dies out completely, we don't just have static. I guess that's arguable, but apparently, not just a static relationship, but one in which it can be conversational. And there's a lot of that conversational VR and AR that's happening, Terminal 3, Fall in Love, that are allowing us to use natural language processing to have a conversational relationship. And then Magic Leap, we just had an incredible installation from the Assad Malik, who did Terminal 3, playing with this kind of theatrical piece with Poppy, the internet star, which was kind of, I thought really well done with the limitations of the field of view of the Magic Leap, in terms of turning that room into a whole theatrical canvas for this experience, including live performance. And then we premiered Micah at New Frontier, who is the social AI of Magic Leap. She's full human-scaled hologram that can sit and stand and manipulate the room around you. She took a picture off the wall of of a kind of a pipe, pulled it out into a 3D object and handed it to me. She's not verbal, but she is pretty faithful to the interaction. Now there's a lot of questions around, why, again, another woman, like there's all these questions around why is she in this particular form, but it was pretty interesting to meet Micah. And then bringing a little Bitcoin. Amelia Winger-Bearskin's doing a Bitcoin wampum. She's an indigenous woman looking at how, if at all, can the erasure of history that happens, like the fact that the Constitution looked like that originally in the first draft because it lifted completely off of the Iroquois League of Nations Constitution. And then the Founding Fathers took everything except the role of women and the role of stewardship of the environment from the Iroquois. And so she's seeing now in this Bitcoin kind of, in the ways in which we're looking at, the ways in which the distributive internet might be able to preserve stories that have been erased over time through traditional history making. And then the robots are here. Stephanie Dinkins is an artist that is been in conversation with a social AI robot for 5 years now and is actually starting to consider if she needs to create robot rights, because this is a robot that's, has citizenship and is a philosophy major at a university, and her conversations have led to her own existential crisis around the ability to simulate consciousness. And then we're looking at, how the wearable environment will change, how cyborgonian are we becoming, the ways in which biometrics and the activity that you are able to read through your, in your brain as input, as device, how that's changing the canvas for artists. I won't tell you more, but how we're hacking the wearables that people are continuing, and how people are actually embedding technology into their bodies, and how that changes their sense of what it means to be human. This artist talks about, he's been wearing this in his head at the time that I spoke with him for 10 years, and it turns color into sound because he's colorblind. And he has a very different relationship to the world based on this assisted technology, this additional aspect of his body. And he works with a choreographer who wears vibration technology that kind of feeds live data of seismic activity and vibrates on her body. And she's like, I can't just see the earth as a non-breathing object. Like it's a living thing now because I feel it on a daily basis. So as we become more cybergonian, as we create embeddable technology in our bodies like they're doing in Switzerland or in Singapore, creating internet-enabled people, how does that change our sense of reality if we are able to have, our phones already give us a sense of what does it feel to have a superhuman capacity, being able to even see a GPS and navigate a city from a bird's eye view. But as these become embedded in our bodies, how does that change our sense of who we are and our relationship to, the micro realities and the macro realities that are part of our reality every day, but are intangible or invisible to us. And then we get into the DNA hacking and the biohacking. So this is an art. Has anyone seen this before? A few people? Okay, good. It's a little bit of, so this is an artist that went around New York City and collected random, cigarette butts and fingernails and hair and gum, and not only was able to hack the DNA to find out who they are in terms of heredity and in terms of health, but she also was able to use the FBI DNA profiling system to 3D print their faces. And so this is with the things that we understand between just the data that we're worried about in terms of privacy. She's pushing the buttons on, are we post-privacy if we're shedding our DNA? And she's not she's an artist. She just went to a bio lab in Brooklyn that's open to the public, open source, and was able to get this. The next project she did, she bought saliva from a company that sells saliva, and the guy was promised privacy. He was promised that his identity would remain confidential, and she was able to go to his house and pretend to be him on 23andMe and hack his Facebook and do all kinds of stuff based on this vial of saliva that she got from him. And then the worst part of it, she's doing this on purpose to be provocative, to kind of poke holes in the sense of privacy so we can then shore up and create policies around our sense of privacy. But she's been wearing she's been growing his DNA as tissue. So she's now cloning and growing him, and she wears him on her body, and she creates these freaky love poems to him. It's really crazy, but again, to be provocative, to get us to think about, how are we thinking about not only future privacy, but how this impacts, if you think about the panopticon and this idea of if you're always being watched, how it changes culture and how it changes who we are. These are questions that the artists are asking. And then, of course, the last bit of it is thinking about, emerging media that came up in this big survey that I did was DNA itself being media, right? So we already know that we can store data on DNA molecules, whether it be, images or email servers or films. But in Caltech, over the last summer, was able to, and we know, like, this is, the Muy Bridge first moving image that was encoded and recalled off of DNA. But Caltech over the summer was able to create. I met with a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley when we were, and I said, so what does this mean? And I also talked to a bioengineer and documentarian. I said, does this mean that, like, I can have a clone dog in the future that has my family archive in its DNA? And she was like, maybe, I don't know. But I talked to a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who's investing in this area, and I said, so, what should we be concerned with here? He's like, oh, it's just storage. He's like, it's just storage. it's just the best storage, and it's really difficult to recall. So it's not going to be like a DNA DVDs. He's like, this is, just considered as more efficient storage. But then Caltech over the summer, I don't know if you guys have been, in part of this conversation at all, but they created a neural network on DNA molecules that could read handwritten numbers. And so that, like, when I talk about, disruptions to our sense of reality, we now have the ability as human beings to make smart organic matter, which we understood that only God can do in our kind of reality, a year and a half ago, if you believe in God. So these are the ways in which artists are having to reconcile and contend with what is the future of culture and how do we understand these disruptions to what we thought was a stagnant and sure reality. Now, how do we navigate it going forward? Okay, I'm going to skip through this section because I'm already really, how much more time do I have? 10 minutes, okay, sorry. Skipping through all this. But when Bank of America puts out a statement saying that there's a 20 to 50% chance that we're already in the matrix, you gotta ask a question, right? And then, of course, the ways in which, like the medical, like this is, we showed the work of this medical research institution that is taking VR and brain activity monitoring and exoskeletons to do paraplegic therapy, and they're able to reconnect to a point where they can move their toes and hold their bowels. So the technologies that we're developing for entertainment are also having an impact on our physical bodies. So these are all these questions that we have to contend with, and how, what is the optimization that we can do in terms of good, and what is the challenges? So one of the major concerns that I heard, and this is kind of like, I think, a summary of the concerns that I heard, was, the progress of, I would just say, justice broad, even though racial justice is very important, and the development of technologies are not linear. Every time you develop a new technology, you have to have a thought process about the history and systems of oppression that the technology is being created and released into. Think about ways to bend the technology to justice and not allow it to replicate, entrench, and worsen injustice. So this is a call to action for our generation. We learned, I saw with my own eyes at the dawn of VR, when the prototype came through. 2 years later, I'm at the first developers conference, and it's out of 150,000 people with the DK2 kit, only 1,000 were handpicked to be at this, and maybe 25 or 30 women were in the room. And so at the plenary session, a woman from LEVR stood up and said, hey, what are we gonna do about the apparent gender gap? And she got shut down by every executive on the stage, saying, we can't worry about gender politics. This is about getting a return on investment on that $2 billion that Facebook just gave us. We just have to get the best of the best, and these are the people in the room who are the best of the best. We can't worry about it. So it's like a sucker punch to the gut of all the women in the room, like, oh, so you're saying that women aren't the best of the best, and you try to, like, okay, well, maybe, let's think about that some more. And I'll circle back to that. Then I go to MIT, talk to Sepp Kamvar, and he tells me that code is the new superpower. code designs the social process, and the social process designs our world. And he talks about, green spaces and rideshare services and food trucks and Twitter and, real estate and Airbnb, and how this code actually does create the social process that changes our entire sense of culture and the ways in which we move through the world. And then I go to Google and I meet with the head of Google Creative Lab, Robert Wong, and he says, I fear we're not going to be able to achieve a human-centered future because the artists and designers are marginalized in this field, and they're not seen as people that have a real voice at the table in terms of considering the implications of these technologies. This was definitely before Cambridge Analytica, but then I go to Oxford and I meet with the head of one of the top tech companies in the world. He's the head of the Envision department, which is their futures department, that they build out offices and homes in the pipeline technology. And he showed me a video of the future, which was quite soulless, but quite impressive technologically. And I said, this is amazing, but I noticed it's not, it's a little bit soulless. I hate to ask, but do you have anyone from the arts or the humanities on your team? And he said, no, we're just engineers. And I said, well, how are you imagining the future without anyone from the arts and the humanities? I love engineers. I have an MBA myself in terms of how the engineering and business community can help us move forward. But I imagine that there's something missing if you're not bringing the arts into it as well. And he goes, you know what? That's a blind spot. He said, I never even considered that. And I think about the analogy of the Columbia Space Shuttle and when NASA came back with why did that tragedy happen? And ultimately they talked about the blind spot of groupthink, of hierarchical structures in terms of their command chain, and that they didn't have diversity of thought. And I think that is really an analogy for the position that we're in at this really important part, at the beginning of this epoch of this next media evolution, is that what are the blind spots? What is the group think? What is the lack of diversity of thought that might be blinding us from the optimization, and also might be leading us to some of these missteps? And then you go back in time and you look at the dawn of mass media, right, that last epoch, and we think about the dawn of film, and we think about this is the first feature film that ever existed that positioned black men as that to be feared. And we think, oh, well, that was a long time ago, but still the doll test in 2019 is we still have black people themselves are afraid of themselves. We still know that implicit bias is a deeply entrenched part of the over-policing and over-disciplining of black men and the over-incarceration. So these are not just, oh, that was a long time ago. These things have long-lasting effects of the blind spots that we may carry into it. And you think about now, the World Economic Forum calling this the fourth industrial revolution, which is AI, bioengineering, immersive media, XR, and Internet of Things. And I think about, well, where were we in the last industrial revolution? And I think about who was not at the table to contribute to the value system making and the thought process around how do we wield this new power. And I think about Heather Ray's comment, who's a filmmaker at Sundance, that talks about because there was a marginalization of the voices that, like the wampum, where the environmental stewardship got taken out of the Constitution, how we're now paying the price of climate change from that blind spot. So I think about how can we avoid that going forward? And these are all the concerns. One quick thing I shared earlier about the innovator stereotype, and you gotta understand how dangerous story can be in this context. They asked, you can see women came into the medical, law, and physical sciences at the same time that they came into computer science back in the 60s and 70s, and they fell off a cliff in computer science in 83, 84. Does anyone know why women dropped out, where they're almost at parity with men in the other fields now in 2019? It was the stories that were being told at the time by the marketing companies of Microsoft and Apple that were targeting young white boys, which, from a marketing standpoint might have made sense in terms of income and who could afford, but and film followed suit with things like Weird Science and War Games and Revenge of the Nerds, which centered male geek identity. And when they went back to interview all the women that dropped out of their positions at tech companies and in computer science programs, they said, well, I started not to feel smart enough. started to just feel like I didn't belong. And so you have an inferiority complex, which was called the stereotype threat, that was triggered just by the storytelling that was told. And we started to perform our own sense of, we started to perform inferiority. But at the same time, they said that they started to get hazed by the men in their program that before that weren't getting hazed. So you also triggered hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity in the same 2 years of storytelling. This is how critical it is as we go forward to think about these, the ways in which representation and in which we're thinking about these, that they're not just innocuous things. So I won't go into all the things, but there was articles about all these things on makingyourreality.org. But I was feeling really depressed about it. And then I was walking, I was at the School World Forum at Oxford, and I was walking down the street. I was like, oh my God, this is really depressing. And my colleague, Tabitha Jackson, who runs the doc program, looked at me. She goes, well, it hasn't happened yet. And I thought about Jane Jacobs, and I thought about, the ways in which when New York City was going through this massive innovation cycle, where she had to stand in Washington Square Park and say, this is a green space and a community space that I find valuable, whether it's more efficient or more financially productive or not. And I don't think that it's just about holding ground into the past, but I think it's about considering not just the economic impacts of the future of work or 100x returns on investment, but it's thinking about what is the future of culture? What is the future of a lived experience in the worlds that we're designing through the business models and the technologies that we're designing? And beyond just design thinking, which thinks of the whole consumer, how are we thinking of the whole person and the ecosystem of culture in which that person lives in? So I just want to leave you with that hopefully we can kind of call on Jane Jacobs as we think about how we are designing the future of culture in every decision we make now. Thank you.